Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very, very happy to welcome you back to the afternoon session of the International Symposium on Cultural Diplomacy and Sustainable Developments. Really pleased to have a quite balanced panel discussion right now, where we actually have 4 different voices representing different fields as well as different countries that I think should help us to shed some insight on the topic of sustainable development. My ultimate goal in this panel is that really you will actually lead the panel. So I'm going to begin with an introductory question. I'll give each panelist a chance to briefly respond. And then I'm very much hoping that you can then actually come with your own questions for the panel and also for each other. We should really see this, we're all one group. So also I think it's very interesting to have interactions going back and forth between participants. So in that sense, we'll try not to have many rules. This is really a chance for us to have interactive discussion amongst each other. We will do this once a day, every day. So you may have seen every day at 2:30 is the interactive discussion. Let me begin by saying a few words about the panelists on the panel, who I will present more fully once they give their keynote addresses. But now just briefly to hear a little bit who's here on the panel. To my left, I'm very honored and pleased to have the chance to have with us Gérard Biraud, who's the former chairman of the Joint Inspection Unit of the United Nations. I think in particular he's an exception also today, and really his perspectives will be quite interesting to us amongst some of the more political and diplomatic perspectives that we've had this morning. So I'm really happy to have you here on the panel, and we're looking forward to your lecture later today. To my right, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Catherine De Ferrier, Coordinator Certificate of Advanced Studies and Corporate Social Responsibility here at the University of Geneva. So I'm happy on the one hand to have an academic amongst us, but I think it's maybe not fair to label you totally as an academic. I think also a practitioner in many ways too, really where I think she does have a wide range of experience, much beyond also what she's doing in the classroom at the University of Geneva. So I'm very pleased to have Dr. Catherine De Ferrier with us as well. To my far right is Dr. Candace Howarth, a research fellow at the Global Sustainability Institute, Faculty of Science and Technology at the Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge in the United Kingdom. So I'm happy to have you here, and I think we really will benefit from your perspectives, in particular the issue of sustainability. I'd like to begin the panel discussion with a general question. Let me first read the title for the discussion. Sustainable Development Since the 2008 World Financial Crisis. Policy Trends over the past 5 years and the current status of sustainable development. The question I wanted to ask is, what impact has the financial crisis had on sustainable development? On the one hand, we're talking about austerity, saving, cutting. We have a lot of crises, European Union to name one. In the midst of this, somehow we are trying to continue with sustainable development. Is this possible? Is there a disconnect? So my general question, maybe Mr. Biraud, we could begin with you. What impact has the financial crisis had on the field of sustainable development?
Thank you. I read the newspapers as you. Professionally, I am not working in this area. But from my previous experience, I think that this crisis, especially in Europe, and for a number of powers who were supposed to be the main donors and the main contributors for mandatory contributions in the various organizations, is producing a real change of perspective. It has produced a change of perspectives in ministries of finance, of budget in countries like mine. And it's quite what is now said by a country that I used to represent in terms of solidarity, generosity, availability, is becoming really different. My question is how the whole community, and there were doubts this morning on the sustainability of the division between developed and developing countries, and I agree to this. We are in a much more complex system. How will the various kinds of countries, economic kinds of countries, will react to this new situation? Will it help them to take themselves, their fate in their hands, or will it be just a kind of acceptance, sad acceptance of less flows of ODA. This is one of the questions I would like to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ferrier, I think today one of our goals is really to set the stage for the conference for the next 3 days. We had a number of the major global governance institutions present, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, World Trade Organization, United Nations Development Program. My question to you, as we look at this framework or this stage in which we're discussing sustainable development, what impact, again, has this financial crisis had on sustainable development? Has it made things only more difficult? Is this maybe also an opportunity, in the sense sometimes when you're backed in a corner, the best can also come out in terms of really seeing the urgency and reacting in a proactive way? What impact do you see the financial crisis is having on the field of sustainable development?
Well, thank you, Mark, for inviting me to try and answer this question. I think that before we can really answer the question, we need to go back to the roots of the causes of the financial crisis. Why did this crisis happen? And if you look into it, the major causes of this crisis is the lack of responsibility. Lack of responsibility from banks, lack of responsibility from the financial markets, too much deregulation, induced maybe too big growth in market derivatives, too many risks taken in the financial markets, the subprimes, too much money was borrowed by borrowers who couldn't repay their loans, etc., etc. So there's an irresponsibility from the banks, irresponsibleness from corporations, but also lack of responsibility from governments, maybe from lacking regulation of all these markets. So I think that the crisis has really helped to put the finger on this particular aspect. And now what is very relevant is that stakeholders, mainly civil societies, employees, everyone is really asking for more responsibility from companies and also from governments. So I think that's one major consequence of the crisis. Now, is this already implemented? Are governments responsible? Companies responsible? That's maybe a second question to answer.
Okay. Well, thank you for those initial reflections. I'd like to ask the same question to you, Dr. Howard. As someone who specializes in global sustainability, can one discuss global sustainability when one has, let's say, strategies or policies that haven't proven so sustainable, especially as we look within, let's say, the UN, the US, as you were saying, the problems that led us into this match. How do you see the impact of the financial crisis when it comes to the bigger picture of global sustainability?
Well, I'd have to really mirror a lot of what's been said already. And as you were saying, I think this is actually an opportunity, really, to not only just learn from the mistakes that were made and what actually caused this recession to start with, and perhaps this is actually a lesson for sustainability. What can we learn from what's gone wrong, and actually draw the parallels between economic recession, the impact it's had, and the role of sustainability. And actually, I think sustainability is very much embedded in how we go on from here. I mean, people are talking about economic growth and how sustainability is part of that. It's not just an objective and aim to attain. We're talking about employment opportunities, economic growth, really about synergies between people, collaborations. I think although we are in a situation where solutions need to be found, sustainability can actually play quite a significant role in achieving economic growth in a more sustainable manner to ensure that a similar issue isn't replicated in the future.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. The second question that I'd like to pose to the panel is also related more broadly to the topic of the conference in terms of what is the potential for linking cultural diplomacy with sustainable development. One of the challenges that I think we're seeing in Europe, and I think it's true of other countries as well, is the fact even though many countries realize that we're in a crisis, the ability to come together in partnership with other countries to find solutions seems to be very challenging. Greece, of course, is a big challenge right now for the European Union. So I just wanted to see, in general, what relevance the panel sees for, let's say, cultural diplomacy and sustainable development. Can we just focus on the politics and the economics? Is culture irrelevant to this discussion? Does cultural diplomacy maybe have a potential at least strengthening some of these relationships, even in times of austerity, to help enable more collaboration and really the recognition that we live in what is called an interdependent planet, in the sense this idea for a long time that countries' end goal was to become independent seems to be an old philosophy. I think as important as it is, and as much as I would encourage countries, fight for your independence, go for it, as soon as you're independent, I think you need to realize that actually we live in an interdependent world. And as much as you want to be free and do your own thing, you can't. We were talking earlier about climate change. I mean, many of these global issues are not issues that one country can solve alone. So our thesis at the Institute is that this is an interdependent world. We do need to collaborate. And we see a relevance also for the cultural diplomacy to help. But I'm be curious, since we have a panel of actually individuals who aren't necessarily experts of cultural diplomacy, I'd be very curious to hear your perspectives there. Do you see a chance? Do you think that we should be putting more resources, more effort into cultural diplomacy initiatives? Or should we just stay focused on the hard power, the politics, and the economics? Maybe ladies first, or Dr. Ferrier, or if you wouldn't mind?
Well, I think that you can, like you say, I'm not a specialist of cultural diplomacy. I really had to look into it and see what it was about. But I think that there is a cultural issue when it relates to sustainable development, and in particular, it is very remarkable the lack of comprehension between public sector and private sector. They tend not to speak to each other, or they try to, but maybe they don't understand each other. First, because they don't have the same objectives, the same goals. They're not driven by the same opportunities, the same objectives again, and hence they don't speak the same language. And but at some point there is a convergence between their needs and their interests, both private and public sector. And what is remarkable is the way they talk about sustainable development. So sustainable development from public sector perspective is traditionally the conjunction of social, economic, and environmental issues. While when you speak of sustainable development from the private sector's perspective, you would use the terms people, planet, profit. But in the end, aren't these the same thing? Or isn't it just two different ways, a different vocabulary to speak of the same thing? So I think here the cultural gap is maybe not the traditional cultural differences we would think of spontaneously, but is more a question of corporate versus organization or public cultures.
No, thank you for that, and you raised some good points regarding the private sector, which I want to come back to in a moment. But first of all, on the issue of cultural diplomacy, would you like to offer something, Dr. Hart?
Yeah, of course. I think that there is an absolute obvious link, and cultural diplomacy really can be used as a mechanism to aid sustainable development. When you think of cultural diplomacy, same as you, I'm not an expert, so I did a bit of research before coming here, and something that really came out was the fact that cultural diplomacy is very much about people's values and identity, and looking at people on the individual level as well, so not just the higher level. And people within even the same country, the same culture, have different values, different beliefs, different levels of awareness and understanding. And in order to really achieve sustainable development, an understanding, fundamental understanding of this and barriers that people face on a day-to-day basis, whether it's the individual level or higher corporate level, really can help move things forward. So I think fundamental to this is really using cultural diplomacy as a mechanism to understand not only the issues out there that people are facing, but also understanding ways of overcoming these barriers.
Thank you very much. Mr. Biraud, as someone who's seen this from the point of view of the United Nations, really working at the highest level, how would you see this, the relevance of cultural diplomacy when it comes to sustainable development in the context of the financial crisis?
Word culture is not much used in the UN diplomacy because it's considered as tainted by some important elements of the cultural world. But to realize that we belong to various cultures is a first step, a very important first step to do anything else with others. That's, in my view, one of the raison d'être of the cultural diplomacy. In this regard, countries, communities, governments are exactly like people. There are two ways to react to some common danger: to come back in its own home and try not to see anything else away, or to consider that my neighbors and myself, we have the same problem. Maybe my neighbors very far. Maybe my government, my region, maybe my country neighbors have the same problem. And why not to speak about this problem together? And why not to look what we could do together for this problem? For me, this is the second, this is the only good choice possible. And I noted this morning a number of words used by the various speakers, which are really going into this direction. We can come back to this later. But I would not like to be in the shoes of the new French president, for instance, because we are now really at a time where all references inherited from the past have gone. All normal economic and financial flows are put into questions, into big questions, where we know, but few people realize this enough to act together, that there is a climate change, a number of things to do in terms of environmental behavior. And so this is very difficult at all levels in the country, even for those who have what was called the power. And it is the same in the organizations. If you follow the World Health Assembly some weeks ago, the International Conference on Labor Conference right now, everything has to be reviewed, revisited, reinvented. I would not say in the dark, because the past is bringing many lessons, but certainly with less assurance, less arrogance than the powers could have before. In one way, it's a chance, because it gives, especially when you link this with the new technologies, the social networks, it gives, as it was said this morning, a voice to everyone. And a voice to everyone is the contrary of 100 years of international diplomacy, where governments were only speaking with governments. When inside each country, everyone has the power to organize, at least to solve some problems, with the modest means available locally, but to organize themselves, and in my view, democratically, is a very important word, to have a real bottom-up move, as it was said by Cécile Molinier this morning, and to have the governments in all countries, in all continents, in all regions, hearing what's coming up from organized people. I will stop here. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that, and you actually got me thinking a little bit too. You mentioned the example of France, and you wouldn't want to be in the situation of the French president now. If I may, let me ask you a follow-up question related to that. France is actually, technically speaking, the oldest in the game when it comes to cultural diplomacy. It was in 1871 when France started the Alliance Française, which is actually the first official use of this concept, cultural diplomacy. Since 1871, of course, a lot has changed, but I'd love to hear your response in terms of, let's say, what you would recommend for French foreign policy, whether it's sustainable development or cultural diplomacy in the future. For those of you who aren't as familiar with French cultural diplomacy, one of their leading institutions is the Alliance Française. They also have the Institut Français. Both of those organizations are very concerned with promoting France and French culture abroad. In Berlin, one of our neighbors is the Institut Français. They have a Cinéma de Paris. You can see French movies. You can take French courses. They have French exhibitions. So in many ways, in a positive way, they're helping to make it easier for individuals to get access to French culture. Another part of French policy is a little bit more limiting in the sense, whether, let's say, a great example, quotas on the radio. As we know, France has a fairly high quota on the radio in terms of how much music can be in other languages, how much music is in French. Brussels has also passed legislation on this. Germany has a quota as of 5 years. It's a different philosophy in the sense that really cultural policy or cultural diplomacy is about protecting, about actually making it more difficult for some kinds of exchanges to take place to prevent things like imperialism. Many talk about the cultural imperialism of the U.S. Something in many ways it's a response to say, hey, let's stop these big waves and give a chance to French film directors, etc. So I just wanted to ask you, looking at these two different forms of cultural diplomacy, on the one hand protecting, let's say blocking, making certain exchanges more difficult, on the other hand promoting, like the Americans also did in the Cold War, where they would send jazz musicians around the world to try to present the positive aspects of American culture. How do you see cultural diplomacy in the future, in particular French cultural diplomacy? Can it support sustainable development? If so, what forms of French cultural diplomacy do you think would be the most effective?
I would not like to consider that exporting the use of our language is the main aim for cultural. It's not, for me, Alliance Française, it's an instrument, but for me, cultural diplomacy is going much beyond language. Cultural diplomacy, it's one of the reasons why I came here. I wanted to know what was cultural diplomacy and to know this from you in particular. Why? Because these two words, I had not much heard them together. I heard about cultures, I heard about diplomacy, but for me, the main way to put them together is openness. Openness, which in my view is a good resume of many notions that we heard today, is for me the key of cultural diplomacy. Openness is accepting that the others are other than us, are different. And yes, we realize we are in a lone planet, in the same planet, for many cultural, many environmental reasons, and many technological reasons, it's becoming more and more obvious. But if this is not to do something about this, I don't see the interest of doing anything in one language or another language. What is important for me, for instance, is not the use of French, it's the multilingualism in the UN. And even if France was very much behind the 1995 resolution on the first resolution in the UN General Assembly on multilingualism, it was done for and with the Spanish-speaking persons and all the other languages. And it's still a fight for obvious reasons of finance, which will not be easier. For instance, when I came here, I even did not wonder if I would have to speak English or French today, because I suppose that there are no interpreters available here. But that's the only good reason. Alliance Française and the enormous efforts made by France for technical cooperation in terms of, especially in North Africa and Africa some 20, 30 years ago, is, in my view, has been an asset for those who benefited from it. But the asset should be, we should understand that there are not one language in the UN, and I'm very firm on this. There are various languages, and they should be used. When I was in UNDP Geneva, it's where I learned English, by the way, because at school it was a disaster. But when I was in UNDP in Geneva, when I came out of, after 2 years, at least half of the people were speaking French among themselves. When I arrived, there was 10%. So at the same time, they were doing it for me, to help me, and that was very nice, but they discovered that it was also good for themselves. And here also, to know that somebody can be different is per se a good thing. Thank you.
Very important points. I'd like to follow up with 3 points, and then I want to come back to the private sector. First of all, you raise a good question. As we discuss sustainable development in the context of globalization, where are we going? What is the goal? You were referring to a little bit this melting pot analogy. Is the idea that we all melt our cultures into a boring gray soup where we all speak English, we wear the same clothing, we have no local cultures? I hope not. So I think I'm not really a friend of this melting pot analogy. I'm more of a friend of the mixed salad analogy, that we can somehow mix this together in such a way that an olive stays an olive, a carrot stays a carrot, a tomato is a tomato, but it's mixed together in this healthy globalization snack, so to speak. And I think that's a very important question we need to decide on in the outset. Where is it we want to go? Do we want our children and our grandchildren going to schools where everyone looks the same, where everyone is in, listening to the same music, speaking the same language? I don't think so. I think that would be a very boring world. So that's a very important, I just pose that as a question. That we can refer to, and I'll give you the microphone in a second. Second point I wanted to respond is the issue of access. We would argue at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, the main challenge facing human beings in the world is actually a challenge of access. Some human beings in the world have access to what they want and what they need. Some human beings don't have access, whether it's access to peace, access to food, access to education, access to many things. That seems to be the fundamental challenge of sustainable development. I would argue also the fundamental challenge of cultural diplomacy. How do we make it easier for individuals to access other cultures, to access education, to access these opportunities, as opposed to making it more difficult to them with regulations or quotas or things like that? So that's the second point I wanted to make. And again, I'm hoping we can debate this later. Access, I would argue, is really at the heart of what cultural diplomacy should be about, and sustainable development. Final point I wanted to make, since you were referring to it, since this is the first day of the conference, I think we should at least offer one definition for what cultural diplomacy is. You've probably read the ICD webpage. You've probably seen a little bit here and there. You may have seen this definition on the webpage. The definition I often refer to, even though it's still not a perfect definition, I think it is one that we can work with the next few days, is from a political scientist. His name is Milton Cummings. He summarizes it, I think, effectively, and there are 3 reasons why I like this definition. But first, let me read it for you. Cultural diplomacy, the exchange of ideas, information, art, and other aspects of culture among nations and their peoples to foster mutual understanding. I'll read it again. I tend to speak fast, as you know. The exchange of ideas, information, art, and other aspects of culture among nations and their peoples to foster mutual understanding. The three things I like about this is, first of all, the first point he makes, exchange. I would argue cultural diplomacy in all of its forms, whether it's during the Cold War period, whether it's the Confucius Institute from China, or whether it's Alliance Française in Rwanda, is in some way about exchange. That always, in my opinion, would have to be there for it to be cultural diplomacy exchange. It can't just be a one-way street. Second point I like about this, target audience, among nations and their peoples. So it's not, as you're referring to, just government to government anymore. It's also people to people. And I think if we look at the origins of culture diplomacy, it actually goes much earlier than Alliance Française in 1871. I would argue really the first individuals, the first citizens that had some sort of an exchange, whether it was pilgrims, voyagers, who knows, they were in effect cultural diplomats. They were in effect doing a cultural diplomacy, even though they didn't call it. You could make the argument that everyone in this room is a cultural diplomat just by being here. Everything that you say or don't say, everything that you do or don't do is an expression of who you are, and in essence, actually expression of your culture. So that's the second point I like about it, target audience. I think really civil society just as important as the national level. Final thing I like about the definition, the goal. Here he's saying the goal is to foster mutual understanding. And I take it a step further to say even more than understanding, the goal hopefully should be trust. Again, I'm not saying we should all agree, the goal is not consensus, but that we do have actually a working trust that allows us to work together. So there's a definition I'll just throw out there since we're walking around culture diplomacy, but just so you can see at least one definition that hopefully we can debate. At the end of this conference, I'd be very happy to have 30 different definitions. But this definition, I think, more or less holds together throughout the 20th century. I'll underline one extreme period, of course, would be the Cold War, where really cultural diplomacy was very much synonymous with propaganda and also advertising. It was obviously a very extreme case where you had really two sides trying to literally convince the other side and the rest of the world that their entire way of life, almost, was somehow superior than the other. So that's an exceptional period where I think you can argue it was very much linked to political propaganda and agenda. But even in that extreme situation, I think you could say mutual understanding was a goal. So I'm just trying to show you also some of the limits of the definition. But now I know you've been waiting. If you could please maybe offer your responses to what was just said. And also I'll give you the additional task, refer a little bit to the private sector also. What role do you see the private sector having in sustainable development? Everyone seems to point the finger at governments these days, but what responsibility does the private sector have when it comes to sustainable developments and some of the issues that we were talking about?
Well, before answering your last question, I would like to make a comment on what's been said just now. And I wanted to raise a question, but maybe now I should raise it more as a challenge than a question, because you've partly answered the question I wanted to ask you about the role of cultural diplomacy with sustainable development. My point was that sustainable development is mostly a Western concept. So it's linked with market economy, market capitalism. It doesn't question economic growth as an objective. It simply tries to limit negative impacts of economic activities on the environment, on societies, and hopefully try to balance all of these three aspects. But still, it's from a cultural point of view, it is still a very Western concept. In my opinion. So the question I wanted to ask, and maybe I should phrase it differently, is what can cultural diplomacy do anything to voice other points of views on sustainable development than the Western point of view? Or how can cultural diplomacy maybe give voice to minority groups, to indigenous populations, and know and share what with the rest of the world their points of view on sustainable development?
It's a good question. Maybe I'll offer a brief response, but I'd be more interested to hear what you have to say. I think cultural diplomacy, the first task of any cultural diplomacy initiative, I would argue, is to break stereotypes. Let me for a moment forget everything I think I know about you and everything I think I know about your culture and try to come to a point where I'm really, let's say, very humble and I really listen. The foreign minister of Mozambique said last year when he spoke in Berlin at ICD, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. We need to listen more. And I think diplomacy and also cultural diplomacy, that's really at the heart of it. So I think first task of cultural diplomacy, listen. Try to break stereotypes whenever possible. If there's misinformation, correct misinformation. If there's lack of information, supplement that. And the second task, as you were saying, to bring people together who normally wouldn't come together, to give voices to individuals who maybe don't normally have voices. I think it's getting easier today. We have social media, we have Facebook, we have Twitter. This conference is also being Twittered, I can inform you. I've been following it earlier this morning. So in that sense, I think those are ways in which we can give voices to individuals who normally don't have voices. So I would agree with you. I think that should be part of culture diplomacy, not just to bring the same individuals in the room who normally come. To go a step further, one of the challenges ICD always has is to avoid preaching to the choir. Everyone in this room, I'm very happy you're here, but actually you don't really need this. In the sense you're here because you're interested in culture diplomacy, you're interested in sustainable development, which is great, but to a certain degree we're preaching to the choir. So of course I think we will have some very fruitful exchanges. I'm sure we'll all think a little bit differently about these issues when we go back home. But the real urgency is the people who aren't interested in culture diplomacy, the people who aren't interested in sustainable development, the people who say, these are issues that aren't relevant. They're the ones we really have to be reaching. So that's the challenge also for all of you, how we together as a network after this week can try to really reach out more to do, let's say, local initiatives in your own home communities where we can try to bring people to the table who maybe wouldn't normally sign up for an ICD conference or a conference on sustainable development. So I'll stop there. I have many more things I could say. I want to actually pose a question to the audience also, a question that you just posed. But before I do that, let's give a chance maybe to Dr. Howard, if you'd like to offer some reflections on some of the things said, and then I'll pose my first introductory question to all of you to get the discussion going.
But then I'll answer your second question.
All right, okay, it's fine, no problem. Or would you like to do that now? Or? Okay.
Thank you. I'd have to agree with what's been said. Really, cultural diplomacy really has an opportunity to give voice to a lot of people who necessarily wouldn't speak on these particular subjects. However, it's not that easy to get through to people who wouldn't necessarily come to an event like this. How do you get through to people, especially at the moment within the recession where perhaps environmental issues and sustainability really is not top of their agenda? So perhaps this is sort of opening up the floor to people with suggestions on how do you get through to people, what works, what doesn't work, what actually do we need to sell it as cultural diplomacy or sustainable development to still get the same objective? Does that matter? What messages are useful? Do we need to be talking about climate change science, or does it need to be about something that gets through to people? As long as we all achieve what it is we're looking to achieve, how can we get through to those individuals?
Excellent question. So I would immediately, forward that question to the audience. But before that, you wanted to respond. Did you want to offer a brief response? And then don't forget that question, the challenge of Dr. Howard.
You asked me a question about the role of the private sector in sustainable development.
Please.
So I haven't forgotten that question.
Well,
if you consider the development of environmental law, particularly at international level, since 40 years, 1972 and the Stockholm Conference, it has been a booming area. We have now more than 500 conventions, either at regional and international level, that exist to protect the environment. But in the end, they're still very difficult to implement. And the question is who is in charge in the end of implementing and respecting these regulations. It's the people and it's companies, it's the private sector, civil society and the private sector. So maybe the thing, again, cultural thing, would be to try and look at the problem from a different point of view and consider the environment not as a constraint from a regulatory point of view, for instance, but as a trigger for innovation from the private sector point of view. And maybe in this way, you can have companies, in particular, being more involved in sustainable development and corporate social responsibility.
Excellent. No, and I think there too, just to take it a step further, I think also if one can articulate, and this is maybe our task as academics or researchers, what is the benefit also for companies in doing this, then it's even easier. And I think there is a benefit. You mentioned corporate social responsibility, also socially responsible investment. There are many examples where companies have actually increased their profit by also doing better corporate culture diplomacy or sustainability initiatives. So I think that's the key. As we know, the private sector, after all, they're for-profit companies, they're trying to make money. That's okay, let them. But show them also how they can benefit as a company and benefit society by engaging in these initiatives. We have a new department at ICD looking exactly at that, actually, corporate culture diplomacy, trying to engage more with the private sector. So I think we've got a lot of fruit for discussion already. I'm looking at the clock, it's already 3:20. So I think now would be a good time to turn it over to you. This is a chance, first of all, for you to ask any questions that you'd like of the of the panelists and of each other. One question I'd love to just throw out there, underline, and then we'll go straight to you, is a question that you actually posed, Dr. Ferrier. Is sustainable development a Western concept? I think it's a very interesting question. On the one hand, the immediate answer maybe is, oh yes, of course, because we're using the vocabulary very often. On the other hand, as we look at, let's say, Aboriginal communities, or very often the simplest of, let's say, villages in sub-Saharan Africa, you could make a very good statement that they've actually got many more answers than we do about how to really respect nature and actually really do things in a much more sustainable way. So I think it's a very provocative question. Is this a Western concept, or are we actually very late in the game to realize these things? And we're, let's say, some Aboriginal communities, as an example, much farther ahead of us, and we've actually deleted those transitions through the globalization process. So it's one question, you can take it or leave it, but I'd love to hear some perspectives. Is sustainable development a Western concept? But let's begin in the back. I already saw the first hand there.
Yes, thank you. This is Jana Pöri. I'm from Finland, but I live here in Switzerland. I was just wondering, what is the definition for sustainable development that we're talking about, since there are now already a different kind of ideas, and it's a Western philosophy. And now if Dr. Howarth would like to tell us, because I see that you are in the Global Sustainability Institute. So is there a definition that is more global, or, because I wouldn't want to, the definition of my sustainable development is not about growth alone.
Yeah, I mean, there are several definitions of sustainability, as I'm sure everyone's aware of, and they really depend on who's issuing the definition and in what areas it's meant to be applied. The one I personally work to is from the Brundtland Report, which basically it's meeting society's needs today without jeopardizing the needs of future generations. But that is such a broad concept, really, and it really needs to be narrowed down specifically according to the issues that are under discussion. In terms of environmental sustainability, it's about ensuring that the way we use our resources is as sustainable as possible, understanding the risks of depletion and the implications to society, not just geographically where we may be now, but all over the world. You have political sustainability, you have cultural sustainability. It's really about preserving in as a most efficient manner as you can now and for the long term. But I don't know if other people, in terms of the work that they've carried out, have seen different applications of the definition.
Mr. Biraud, what is sustainable development?
That was not to that I wanted to react, but to the question by Catherine Ferrier, to this name of Western concept. Yes, certainly sustainable development is a Western concept, but United Nations are also a Western concept. What does that mean? Is this negatively affected in your mind when you say a Western concept? Many concepts became universal and are used by a number of people to free themselves, which were Western concepts. So I'm personally proud of a number of Western concepts, including those at the roots of the League of Nations and the United Nations later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, to reply, you could also add human rights to the list of very important concepts that have become universal. No, I agree with what you say. It's just that I am curious to know about the other non-Western cultures' points of view on the issue, and maybe their views can enrich this concept and keep it growing and bring it further.
An African version 4 centuries ago of the Human Rights Declaration. You should try to find and read La Charte du Mangué. It was a text respected by a number of hunters from the Mali area and from various neighboring countries. And you would be very interested to find in this document, and I can give you the text. You would be interested to see how a number of these articles, these ideas, are strangely corresponding to the 1948 Universal Declaration. And by the way, I'm very happy that you remembered me this, because I had the honor to work with Stefan Essel, who was one of the drafters of this UDHR. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Love to hear also other voices who maybe haven't spoken yet. What is sustainable development, and is it a Western concept? I see here, please.
I'm Ferenc Taroli. I'm from Sierra Leone. I live in Switzerland. I think that's enough for now. When I heard the word sustainable development, I just think about another English word called to maintain. To maintain means like, okay, I have 5 francs with me. What should I do with it? How can I spend it? If I spend all my 5 francs, I'm not hoping to get 5 francs again, then I'm scared to spend everything. Then I want to maintain these 5 francs until I have another thing. And mostly in the Western mentality, part of it is about security, financial security, which can be related to all other areas. But I think Western nations want to maintain the standard of living, and also the image of Western nations, and also mostly in the area of finance also. So sustainability, it's mostly about to maintain things so that they don't go to the worst, and to know how really you want things to be in the future too, from my perspective. So.
One thing I have, Karima from Morocco. One thing I have recalled from this morning's presentation, something very important, is ownership by local communities. We cannot talk about sustainability if we don't empower local communities to own their programs, to build their capacity, to seek sustainable funding for their programs. So it's very important to empower local communities to own their programs, and at the same time, if we can call it the donors or the partners would seek to evaluate the impact of their programs on local communities, because several times they have programs that international donors are competing for a lot of programs, but the local communities are not seeing the desired impact. So it's very important to do monitoring and evaluation to ensure sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, okay, in the middle.
Akan Kiboye is my name. I'm from University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. And for me, I would have thought that, sustainability in any form helps the society to understand each other. Linking it to the cultural differences that actually divide them can easily be used to unite them. I will give an example of South Africa, because that is the area I'm working on. You will find out that because of the diversity in cultural differences, it has created some sort of suspicion and misunderstanding and misconception within the society. But with at the end of apartheid has actually given us the opportunity to see that every individual has got something to contribute in the society through sustainable development. And with that understanding each other, we cannot actually promote the cultural diplomacy that needs to build the nation. Thank you.
Hello, it's Hannah, Netherlands, UK. I think about sustainable development, it's not exactly a Western concept, because I think something that's sustainable is something that people have learnt from in the past and something that people develop upon. So even the communities which aren't in the Western region of the world, they use sustainable techniques. And I think through creating a fusion between using old ideas, new ideas, and ideas from different cultures, like you mentioned, that is the correct way to create something that's sustainable, by taking something from every country and seeing, because every country is good at something. So that's the best way to create a sustainable community.
Hello, my name is Aliat. Hi, I'm from Kazakhstan, and in the discussion of whether sustainable development is a Western concept, I would like to reflect on, since I'm coming from developing country, and if you compare the example of Kazakhstan 20 years ago, when we just got an independence, in the speech of government officials, sustainable development as a concept was never used. Because I guess in the mindset of developing countries, there should be development first, and then the task is how to make it sustainable. So for the countries like Kazakhstan, the newly independent states, and developing world as well, the issue is development itself, how you build your economy, how you sustain your economic growth, and then how to preserve that and to use it to tackle the challenges like climate change or how to preserve resources for the next generations. So I don't think, I reflect into what you just said, it's not about the Western concept or as such, but it's more of a mindset and the approach to the concept itself. Thank you.
I absolutely agree with a lot of the different and really interesting views we've had. I think some of the key words that are really emergent are things like value, really appreciating the value of whether it's resources, but also practices that people have used and implemented to achieve sustainability, and really sort of promoting the sense of identity and pride. And in doing so, using cultural diplomacy as a way of really facilitating dialogue between people all over the world, and perhaps maybe moving slightly away from labeling things. Does it really matter, really, in terms of sustainable development? Where does it come from? Because actually it is an international concept. It's been applied for centuries, really, and we have a lot to learn from each other, whether it's from somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa or really just back in the UK. Everyone has a lot to learn. Different practices are being implemented, and particularly the point about monitoring and evaluation, and really documenting lessons learned, what's working, what's not working, whether it's a historical dimension that's been applied, whether it's something really, really new. Do we really need to be reinventing the wheel in some cases? I think there's a real momentum that's just waiting to be launched for everyone to just be sharing their ideas, and then let's start doing more, implementing these.
It depends on which perspective you come from. If you talk about economic security, I think it's a Western thing. It's common in the Western cultures, like to really maintain the financial status and strength. But to this topic about cultural diplomacy, I think it's an open and it's a new concept wherein, okay, I come with my culture and you come with your culture, your cultural skills. Then we maintain the skills, we put them together and reach the goal, and that's part of the unity we are talking about. Unity is not about we agree on one thing, but we reach the same goal. You can come from different directions, but what is important is that everyone focus on the goal. And I think that's what I see it's as a really important point about cultural diplomacy and sustainability.
I'm a Swiss student in law in Neuchâtel. It's a small city next to Geneva. I just wanted to ask a question and make a link between the sustainable development and the actual crisis. We spoke a lot about the fact that sustainable development will suffer and is suffering from the crisis. And shouldn't we more turn this to the opposite and make the sustainable development a key to the crisis and use it and promote it to fight against the actual worldwide crisis? Thank you.
Maybe Mr. Biraud, if you wouldn't mind maybe offering a concluding statement, or if you'd like to respond to some of the reactions, and then we'll start to bring the discussion to a conclusion. Mr. Biraud?
I was, maybe I will anticipate on what I will say a bit later, but we are seeing a number of countries, organizations preparing conferences and speaking much, writing much. But at the same time, we are all under not important, extraordinarily powerful strengths of the economic world and the economic multinational firms. They are not speaking. They are not in the news. They are acting constantly in a competitive manner with much power, much means, much money, much more than the governments. We have not to be too angelic, as it is sometimes said about some French quarters. Angelic means looking in the eyes in the sky, but not realizing what is the reality of the powers. We are all engaged, including as consumer, in a big war of superpowers. No longer the governments, no longer the classic armaments, but the economic and financial powers. So it's good to see what the governments could do to alleviate a number of aspects of this struggle and its consequences, as the subprime crisis that you mentioned a moment ago. But we should not think that just because we found a new concept, because we add a new report of a new symposium to all what has been already said and exchanged, we will change the world. The world has to be changed first at the local level, as it was said, and bottom up. Everyone is responsible for his governance. And that is how I would like to finish, just by some touch of realistic, maybe sad, but realistic views. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ferrier.
Well, I'd like to stress again that for me, sustainable development, or CSR, the environmental and social challenges that we face today should be viewed as a trigger for innovation and not a constraint from private sector and also government point of views. I also think that there is a lot to achieve through better discussion between stakeholders, trying to match needs, each other's needs, towards a goal that is common to everyone in the end.
Thank you very much. Dr. Howard?
Thank you. I have to say, I know the action needs to come from a local level, needs to demonstrate that there is momentum going, that people are doing something about it, but there's apathy which really needs to be overcome. There's such a huge gap between sustainability and climate change, for example, and the local level. There's such a huge concern and lack of understanding on how change at the individual local level will make a difference. And a main reason for this apathy is the perception that in some areas government isn't doing enough. So there's a need for more transparency, more dialogue, more communication, not just horizontally, but really vertically, demonstrating what is being done and taking pride, really, and really associating one's identity with what is being done and really helping bring value to the whole sustainable development agenda at the local level. And before we see this change at an international and global scale, people really need to take ownership at the local level and understand really what the bigger picture is and their role in this.
I don't know, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the panelists and the participants for helping us to do, I think, a navigation in this one panel discussion, really bringing to the table many of the issues that we'll have the chance to zero in on later today and also the next few days. In particular, of course, the impact that the financial crisis has had on the field of sustainable development. I also appreciated the discussion trying to define what is sustainable development. Is this a Western concept? Is this a much more ancient concept? I also thought it was helpful to bring to the table the questions of cultural diplomacy. What is cultural diplomacy? How might it or might it not interconnect with the future of sustainable development? So for all of those reasons and more, I'd like to ask everyone to please join me in expressing our sincere gratitude to all of the panelists for the panel discussion. Thank you.